So, if you want to introduce yourself a little bit to tell us just a few sentences about your work. Mr. McAuley, if you want to start.
Okay, you go first. All right. Yeah, no pressure. Okay. Well, I started writing when I was very young, but I threw it all away. And I started writing again when I was a little bit older and thought I knew what I was doing. And I've always been interested in science fiction. I found it, I think around about the age of 7, I think I found a copy of Jules Verne's Journey to the Centre of the Earth. I thought, well, this is interesting stuff. Is there more of this? And there was. And I carried on doing that because I always think that we were in a library, and this is where I started my career, not in this library, but I was in another library in a little town in England. And I always think writers are first and foremost readers, and they're voracious readers. That the kid who's always got his nose in the book, or her nose in the book. And it just so happened that the books that I had my nose in were all the science fiction books. I don't know why, but they just there's something about them. Maybe a way of escaping the little town I was living in. Although I am now a writer, I was at first a scientist, so the whole combination, but you don't have to be a scientist to be a science fiction writer anymore, you have to be a ghost to write ghost stories. So although there is quite a bit of science in the quiet war, which I suppose is what I'm talking about a bit here, there's not so much science in some of the other books. So.
What about you? So did you say you're not a scientist, you didn't change your position?
Yeah, I didn't do very much of that. I like Paul, I think, basically I grew up reading science fiction. Not exclusively, but I tended to always go back to it because I found that general literature, there was some good stuff, but a lot of it I found quite dull. And you know, I grew up in a fairly safe, comfortable, middle-class context, and so I knew dull, you know, because that was my life. So I didn't need to read novels about people having dull lives because I was having one. And so I thought, well, you know, what I was much more interested in was stuff that was out there. And over time, I started to realise that, yeah, you want the kind of out there sensation, but at the same time, if you go too far out there and you leave your human contexts behind, then you're not really telling any kind of story that has any weight. And so I think when I started to actually try and write, I was trying to reconcile this love of science fiction with also the fact that so much of what I read was kind of pulpy and I don't know, it didn't have the gravitas that I'd found in other stuff that I'd read. And so I wanted something that had that gravitas. What happened was that in the late 70s I started reading a magazine called Omul, which some of you guys will probably have seen, which was a really high production value, high spec magazine produced by the guy who ran Penthouse. So he had a lot of money, this guy, Bob Guccione, and he basically, for whatever reasons, it couldn't have been for money reasons, he decided that it would be really cool to have a science fiction magazine, a glossy science fiction magazine. And there was some fantastic fiction in that, and the stuff that I stumbled on there was short story by William Gibson, and the kind of the beginning of the cyberpunk era. And that was it, because I think cyberpunk for me was that welding of the kind of the out there excitement of science fiction and fantasy, but it was welded to this very, very realistic kind of a noirish tendency that obviously you could see Gibson, you could see what he'd been reading, you could see where his influences lay. And that was it, I knew that was the moment I saw it and I went, I'm writing this. This is what I want to produce. And that was pretty much it. And immediately I spent the next 14 years not getting published. I knew what I wanted to write, and I kept writing it, and I kept writing it, and I kept sending it to people, and they kept saying, this is not what we want to publish. And I spent 14 years not getting published, because people kept saying to me, you need to change the tone, you need to do this, you need to do that. And I am very stubborn, to a fault. And so I didn't change anything, and I continued not to get published. And and then what happened was, I think the things I was writing, the zeitgeist kind of caught up with that, and suddenly there was an elder darkness in what I wanted to produce, and people weren't very interested in that back in the sort of the 80s and the early 90s. And very slowly that darkness crept into the zeitgeist. And suddenly, yeah, you know, I sheer luck, I just stumbled into the right publishing house. And then yeah, bang! It was like banging your head on a wall, and it suddenly becomes a door. It opens and you fall flat on your face on the other side of it. And yeah, and that's been it. The last 12 years have been as a fully published author. Wouldn't go back for anything. It's occasionally a bit scary because you don't really. The problem with coming into something like novel writing is that you don't really know what you're doing. And the people who buy your books assume that you do know what you're doing. So there's always that slightly scary thing of you. I wonder if I can bluff this one. But you know, the more you bluff, the better you get. And after a while, you wake up one morning and you suddenly go, oh, that guy I was pretending to be, I really am him now. So I guess I'm now an author and I'm stuck with it. Yeah, it's a happy ending. Well, it's not an ending yet, I hope, but it's a happy middle.
I wondered if you have a plan, a structure. How do you construct the settings for your works? If you do that.
Do I have a plan? Well, I have a plan. You have to have a plan these days. The publishers in Britain like to have a plan before you buy a book. So you have to set out a synopsis, something like a detailed synopsis of what you're doing. My problem is that I don't try and make it work as a book. It doesn't. But finding out about the worlds is, well, I've got two strategies. First of all, I write some short stories about them. They may not be quite the same world as in the novel, but they're in that area. So I'm thinking, well, this is something interesting. I'll have some stories in that. So here's some experiments. And then if I'm writing the novel, I basically, although I have an outline, I don't completely outline very much, and find my way into following the characters, and they often end up going in a completely different direction. It can be very annoying. And sometimes characters who I thought were very minor characters turn out actually quite important characters. Years ago I wrote a book called Pasquale's Angel, which is set in Renaissance Florence, except it's Florence with an industrial revolution, it's an artistic revolution. So it's the time of Leonardo. And the hero at one point goes to a newspaper office, and Machiavelli's there working as a journalist. And I thought it was just be one scene with Machiavelli as this hard-hitting, cynical journalist. He turned out to be something other than he's stuck with the kid for the rest of the book, more or less. I don't know why.
What do you expect from him?
Yeah, I know, that's my fault for messing around with Machiavelli. So I have nobody to blame but myself for introducing the kid. So quite often it'll take off in interesting directions that you didn't know at the start of writing a book.
What about the landscape? Because for instance, in Quiet Walk, you have a whole landscape very realistic on several planets, several satellites, and you kind of destroyed the Earth that has been through a lot, and you kind of build this setting, like an opera setting for the characters. Do you think separately about it before to place this story and the characters in it? Or?
Well, the landscapes were what started the novel, actually, and I cheated because they're actual landscapes. They're not invented landscapes. None of the places in the book are really invented. They're all actual features. There's a city which features quite heavily quite well called Paris. It's on Dione, which is a moon of Saturn. It sits on the lip of a double crater, two craters together. And those are actual craters, Romulus and Remus craters. You can find them on maps of the moon. And I got interested because NASA was sending out probes to take close-up images of the moons of the outer planets of Jupiter and Saturn. So you had the Voyager probes, and then you had Galileo around Jupiter, and you've got Cassini, which is still doing intricate dance around Saturn and its moons, taking high-quality images and being able to see the surface. And so I had all of this, courtesy of these brave little robot pioneers. and I just used it. I didn't have to make the stuff up. I just had to try and imagine myself down there. So just had to try and put people in those landscapes. And how would they survive there? What would they build there? And how would they live? And how would living there change them? That was my interest in writing the novels. So it all came from these images of these moons, these very strange, odd, very varied moons.
Do you do research, scientific research, or some preparations for before you write?
Well, too much, probably. And then try and throw as much of it away as possible, so you only use the stuff that's of interest to the story. But I mean, in this case, because it was about living out there, I thought I needed to talk about the landscapes, and so how they evolved, why were they different, and so on. So there are little bits, sort of biographies of the places as much as biographies of the characters. So the places, in a way, are kind of characters in themselves in the novel too. So they're playing a role, shaping the story because of the way those landscapes are. They're playing a role that a character may play.
Why a role?
A background role, but then that.
What about you? Do you plan?
No, I've been very lucky actually because I've always been published by the same people. And of course, the first book that they got from me, it was already done. And they gave me a 3-book deal. And no one really asked me what the other 2 books were going to be. They just said to me, do you have any more ideas? I said, yeah. And so I've been very lucky. And then what happened was that I wrote the 2nd book, and just about the time I was putting together the 3rd book, they came to me and they said, oh, would you like another contract? And so I went, yeah, okay, that's great. So they gave me another contract for 3 more books. And again, they never really asked me what those books were going to be. So I wrote a bit more. And a couple of books later, they said, oh, would you like another contract? And I said, well, I'd quite like to write some fantasy, actually. So they went, oh, all right, well, how about a contract for 3 more science fiction books and 3 fantasy books? So 6 books. And I went, yeah, all right, okay, we'll do that then. And again, no one asked me for anything. They just, and the problem was that I was starting to run behind. So I sort of owed a couple of books from one contract and then this a new contract as well. And even now, I am 4 books behind.
What did they say? They didn't say that.
Well, they weren't very pleased because, I mean, the last